The lock should not have opened. Kale felt it before he understood it, the subtle resistance under his palm, the way the biometric panel hesitated as if recognizing something it wasn't programmed to allow. The corridor outside Julian Crow's private floor was silent, the kind of silence that came from money and fear working together. No footsteps, no cameras blinking red, no reason for the triplet Alpha Kings to be standing there at all, and yet his wolf paced, not agitated, not aggressive, alert. Maddox noticed first. "You feel that?" Riven didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the door, pupils narrowed, breath slow. All three of them stood unnaturally still, like predators who had caught the scent of something wounded but alive. Kale pressed his thumb again. The panel flickered, denied, then unlocked. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it cut through Kale's chest like a warning bell. "This floor isn't on our schedule," Maddox said quietly. "No," Riven replied. "It's on his. Julian Crow, their beta, their strategist, the man who translated their authority into numbers, projections, contracts, sharp enough to ruin cities without leaving fingerprints. Julian was efficient, trusted, untouchable, and meticulous, which was why the locked room at the end of his corridor had always bothered them. No cleaners logged access, no maintenance requests, no surveillance feed, just a blank space in a building obsessed with records. Kale pushed the door open. The smell hit first. Not blood, not rot, but something colder, suppressant, sterile metal. The faint, unmistakable undertone of fear that had nowhere to go. Kale's wolf surged forward inside him, not snarling, not dominant, distressed. The lights inside were dimmed to a perpetual dusk. Against the far wall sat a chair bolted into the floor. Someone was restrained in it. Thin wrists bound with cuffs designed to look therapeutic, soft polymer, padded edges, medical grade, restraints meant to reassure auditors while still doing their job, ankles secured, posture corrected, compliance engineered into posture and breath. The Omega lifted his head slowly. Silas Ward did not flinch. That was the first thing Kale noticed. No scrambling, no panic, just a measured inhale, as if he had learned long ago that sudden movement only made things worse. His hair fell into his eyes, uncut, practical. His clothes were plain, clean, not prison-worn, but carefully chosen to be forgettable. His scent was muted to near absence, suppressants layered on suppressants. Kale took a step forward without realizing he'd moved. His wolf slammed against his ribs, recognized, not claimed, not aroused, recognized with a force that made Kale's breath hitch. Silas's gaze lifted fully then, and for a fraction of a second, something ancient and sharp passed between them. Not fear, knowing. "You weren't supposed to come in here," Silas said softly. His voice was steady, worn, the voice of someone who had learned that volume invited punishment. Maddox swore under his breath. Riven closed the door behind them with deliberate care, as if sealing the moment in place. "Who are you?" Silas's eyes moved to him, assessed, then back to Kale. "I was an analyst," he said, "before I became a liability." Kale's jaw tightened. He scanned the room with new eyes. No bed, no desk, just a sanitation unit, a hydration line, a single shelf of files locked behind reinforced glass. This wasn't a holding space, it was containment. "What's your designation?" Maddox asked, already angry, already calculating. Silas hesitated, just long enough for Kale to recognize the reflex, the pause before truth, the instinct to check which answer was safer. "Omega," Silas said finally, "unbonded." The word landed wrong. Kale's wolf growled low, deep in his chest. An Omega restrained like this, hidden, erased from logs? The imbalance scraped against instinct itself. Wolves tolerated hierarchy. They did not tolerate rot. "Who authorized this?" Riven asked. Silas smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wore when they'd answered this question too many times. "Your beta did." The name didn't need to be said. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, measured, unhurried. Julian Crow appeared in the doorway moments later, his expression already arranged into something between concern and control. His eyes flicked to the restraints, then to Silas, then to the triplets, calculating damage. This is a misunderstanding, Julian said calmly. I can explain. Kale didn't look at him. He was watching Silas. Up close now, he could see the scars. Not fresh, not dramatic. Layered lines along the wrists, the subtle stiffness in the shoulders, the way Silas held his jaw as if bracing for impact that never came. Compliance scars, not punishment, conditioning. Explain, Maddox said coldly. Julian exhaled, relieved at the opening. He's unstable, brilliant but erratic. We tried accommodation, therapy, monitoring. When that failed, containment was the only ethical option. Silas closed his eyes, just for a second. Then he spoke, not to defend himself, not to accuse, but to clarify. I told him the merger would collapse in 18 months, Silas said. I showed him why. He said obedience mattered more than accuracy. Julian's smile thinned. You were experiencing delusions of significance. Kale's wolf surged violently, snapping against restraint, because that voice, Silas's voice, had spoken those words before. Not here, not now, somewhere else, someone else. Kale stepped closer, ignoring Julian entirely. How long have you been in this room? Silas opened his eyes and met his gaze. In this life? He asked quietly. The corridor seemed to tilt. Julian stiffened. Kyle, this is exactly the instability I warned you about. Enough, Kyle said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room answered him anyway. Silas's breath caught, not in fear, but in something dangerously close to relief. And Kale understood, with a clarity that rattled bone and blood alike. This wasn't a locked room. It was a grave that hadn't finished closing, and his wolf remembered who had been buried here. Silas had learned how to exist quietly. It wasn't something anyone taught outright. It came from observation, watching which questions shortened meetings, which truths closed doors, which pauses made people uncomfortable enough to look away. Silence, he discovered early, was not emptiness. It was camouflage. The restraints hummed softly around his wrists, a low vibration meant to ground him. Julian called it therapeutic. The documentation called it preventative. Silas called it what it was, a reminder that movement invited correction. Kale noticed how Silas held himself even after the door was open. Spine straight, shoulders aligned, no slack in his posture, as if the room might punish him for relaxing, and Omega trained not to take up space. Have you eaten? Maddox asked suddenly. Silas blinked, thrown. Yes. How long ago? Silas hesitated again. That pause, Kale recognized it now, the calculation of consequences. This morning. It was night. Riven's jaw tightened. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just outside Silas's reach. He didn't touch the restraints, didn't test them, just observed. Why isn't this logged? Julian answered too quickly. Medical confidentiality. Silas let out a soft breath. No, he said. It's because I stopped being useful. The words weren't bitter. They were factual. Silas's mind drifted, unbidden, to another time, another life, another office with glass walls and polished floors where his projections had once been praised, where his models had predicted collapse others refused to see, where the same calm voice had told him he was too disruptive. The memory ended the same way it always did, with silence. I wasn't loud, Silas continued, eyes fixed on the far wall. I didn't threaten anyone. I just wouldn't revise my conclusions to make them safer. Julian scoffed lightly. You refused alignment. I refused to lie. Kale felt it then, the echo, not memory, not instinct alone, but something deeper. His wolf shifted restlessly, recognizing a pattern that crossed time. An Omega punished not for weakness, but for accuracy. How long? Maddox pressed. Silas swallowed. Since before the acquisition. That meant months, maybe longer. Kale's gaze snapped to Julian. You hid him during negotiations. He was a risk, Julian said smoothly. An Omega analyst with influence is destabilizing. Riven's eyes flashed. So you destabilized him instead. Silas closed his eyes as voices rose, the argument blurring into something familiar. Power debating his existence as a variable. He had lived this once already, died from it. That was the cruel joke of rebirth, remembering just enough to recognize the trap, not enough to escape it early. I don't want vengeance, Silas said quietly. The room stilled. I want choice, he continued. I didn't have it before. I don't have it now. Kale stepped closer, close enough that Silas could feel his heat despite the suppressants. The wolf inside Kale pressed forward, not to claim, not to dominate, but to shield. You shouldn't be here, Kale said, and for the first time, the words weren't an order, they were an admission. Julian's calm chimed sharply. His eyes flicked down, then up, tight. They know, he said. Access breach flagged. Silas's heart sank, not because he feared Julian, but because he recognized the sound of systems waking up. And systems, once awake, did not care who they crushed to restore balance. Julian's entrance was calm, calculated, too calm. He stepped into the room, shoulders squared, expression measured. His eyes scanned the Triplet Alpha Kings, lingering briefly on Kale. There was no fear, only the faintest trace of irritation, as if the world owed him compliance and had failed to deliver. This is entirely unnecessary, Julian said smoothly. Silas is unstable. His reports are unreliable. Silas didn't flinch. He met Julian's gaze evenly, voice low, deliberate. You rewrote my conclusions. You doctored my reports. The merger would fail in 18 months, as I predicted. You made it look like I was overreacting. The room shifted. Kyle's wolf growled softly, a vibration against his ribs that demanded acknowledgement. Maddox stepped closer, eyes narrowing, recognizing the layers of betrayal. Julian's hands moved as if to smooth imaginary wrinkles from his suit. Procedures were followed. Containment is preventive, ethical, necessary. Riven's voice, low and sharp, cut through the taut air. Ethical for whom? Certainly not him. Silas's wrists itched inside the restraints, not for freedom, but for recognition. Finally, someone was seeing what had been done to him, not the damage he had caused, but the damage inflicted. You called me a liability, Silas said quietly. I saved this company millions, and yet I am the threat. Julian tilted his head, a practiced gesture. You failed to align with hierarchy. That's destabilizing. Predictability matters more than insight in operations like ours. Kale's fist clenched. His wolf surged, pressing against restraint he had learned to control for appearances. He recognized this rationalization. He had seen it countless times, power hiding cruelty behind procedure. Silas spoke again, softer, almost intimate. You don't hide mistakes with obedience. You hide them with silence, and you punished me for choosing the truth. Maddox's jaw tightened. Your obedience is not a shield, Julian. Your manipulation is not protection. It's erasure. Julian's smile faltered. He took a deliberate step closer to Silas, but Kale mirrored him, blocking the line of approach without touching. The room was taut with tension, the restrained Omega at its center, his calm a sharper weapon than Julian's bravado. You've rewritten reality, Kale said quietly, voice low but commanding, and we're about to rewrite it back. Silas's gaze flicked to Kale, then to Riven and Maddox. There was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. His shoulders relaxed, fractionally. Not completely, not trustfully, but enough to signal the first step of acknowledgement. Julian's voice rose, controlled but desperate. Kale, Riven, Maddox, this is protocol. You're jeopardizing the company. Kale's wolf growled again, a deep warning that resonated in his chest, vibrating up through his spine. You jeopardized him, and you've been doing it for months. Silas felt the first flicker of hope he hadn't known he could afford. These alphas, who were not bound to him, were seeing. Not just the man Julian painted, but the Omega he had tried to erase. He straightened, lifting his chin, not in defiance, but in recognition of the moment. The room was no longer just a cage, it was a reckoning. Julian exhaled, his composure cracking. You can't! He's not! He's… Kyle's voice cut through sharply, each word measured and fatal. Enough! The lies end tonight. The Omega in the chair didn't move, didn't need to. He had spoken truth. The wolves had heard, and the balance of power had begun to shift. Julian reached for his encrypted tablet, initiating a protocol that could legally erase Silas's existence, and the triplets realized the fight had just become existential. Riven's steps were deliberate, silent on the polished floor, a predator moving through territory he didn't yet claim but instinctively understood. He didn't approach Silas directly. Instead, he circled the chair, letting the wolf inside him scent the air, taste the tension, map the omega in restrained flesh. Silas flinched slightly when Riven paused behind him, the presence heavy and warm, but not aggressive. The restraints hummed, a faint mechanical whisper that reminded him he was still monitored, still contained, still treated as a variable in someone else's calculations. "You're quiet," Riven said finally, his voice calm, almost conversational. "But I can feel you." Silas's jaw tightened. "Quiet keeps me alive." Kyle stepped to the side, watching. Maddox remained at the doorway, hands folded, sharp eyes absorbing every nuance, the tension between predator and prey, authority and truth, restraint and instinct. The room seemed to shrink around Silas. He felt the subtle pressure of their presence, the unspoken analysis, the silent evaluation. The triplets didn't need words to test him. They didn't need threats or commands. Presence alone was weighty enough. Riven's gaze lingered on the marks on Silas's wrists, layered scars that spoke not of sudden cruelty, but systematic conditioning, not punishment, but compliance. Every line, every tiny abrasion was a testament to obedience extracted under duress. The wolf inside Riven pressed closer, not to dominate, but to acknowledge. "You weren't supposed to exist like this," Kale said quietly, his words cutting through the sterile air. "An omega like you, hidden, contained. It's not natural." Silas's eyes flicked to Kale. "I survived. That's enough." "Survival isn't enough," Maddox said, voice low, resonant. "It shouldn't feel like winning to breathe in your own space." Julian's hands twitched slightly over the console, as if he wanted to assert control, but the triplets didn't allow it. They moved in unison, an unspoken barrier, a triangle of authority that was neither cruel nor violent, simply present, simply aware, simply unwilling to allow another injustice to continue unseen. Silas exhaled softly, leaning back fractionally, his eyes closed, a brief reprieve. The room, which had felt like a trap moments ago, shifted in temperature, in energy, in understanding. He realized they weren't here to punish him. They weren't here to claim him. Riven's voice came again, gentle but firm. "We see you, not the Omega they told us about. You, the one they tried to erase." For the first time in months, maybe years, Silas felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. His wolf recoiled, cautious but curious, sensing the absence of immediate threat. He had been invisible for so long that acknowledgement felt strange, disorienting. Kale stepped closer, close enough that Silas could feel the subtle warmth radiating from him. "You deserve more than silence," Kale said. Silas looked at him, not fear, not longing, but assessment. "I'm not sure I deserve presence," he replied softly, almost a whisper. Presence was the thing he had been denied the most. Recognition without expectation, without manipulation, without threat. Maddox exhaled slowly. "We're not here to give you what you deserve. We're here to correct what's been done." Julian's hands shook over the console. "This isn't necessary," he said, voice tight. "Procedures exist for a reason." Kale's gaze met Riven's, then Maddox's. "Procedures are only valid if they protect, not erase," Kale said. "And someone erased him." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You understand." "We do," Riven said simply. The room pulsed with tension and recognition. It wasn't safety, it wasn't trust, but it was a beginning. The wolves didn't claim him, they acknowledged him. And in that acknowledgement, Silas felt the first spark of autonomy he had been denied. He realized then that survival wasn't measured by restraint or compliance, it was measured by who noticed. And for the first time, someone, not Julian, not protocol, not fear, had. Silas shifted slightly in the chair. His voice was low, cautious, but not broken. "Then, what happens now?" Kale's wolf growled softly under his ribs, a vibration of warning and protection. "Now, we see this through." The triplets had entered expecting a challenge of control. What they encountered was something older, sharper, and almost sacred, a truth that refused to bow. And as the night deepened, every presence in that room understood something fundamental. The balance of power was no longer unilateral. Julian's panic was quiet but palpable. You can't. This changes everything. Riven's eyes were fixed on Silas. Everything needed changing. Silas exhaled, his first conscious inhale of the night that wasn't measured for compliance or survival. He was being seen, and for the first time, it felt like the beginning of something that might truly belong to him. Julian's hands flew over the encrypted console, fingers trembling. He was used to absolute compliance, to systems bending to his will, to people being variables he could manipulate. But the triplet alphas weren't ordinary, and Silas refused to be erased. Access override, Julian barked, voice tight. Containment protocols, initiate. Kale's eyes flicked to Riven and Maddox. Every subtle movement, every shift of weight, communicated what words could not. Control is only as strong as the opposition allows. Julian had underestimated them, and the room, once a cage, was now a battlefield of intent. Silas felt the hum of the restraints intensify as the console flashed red. Automated protocols were designed to enforce obedience, to remind him of his place, to make his survival contingent on submission. But he didn't panic. He had survived worse. The wolf inside him bristled, wary but alert. Survival had taught him patterns. He knew where to move, how to observe, how to leverage even the smallest gaps. Riven stepped forward, close but not threatening, his presence a shield over Silas without touching. Protocols are only as effective as the people enforcing them, he said quietly, and you're overestimating your control. Maddox moved toward Julian, slow, deliberate, forcing him to confront the consequences he had avoided for too long. Every system you trust can be disrupted, Maddox said. Every line of code, every override, every rule, none of it matters when the truth is right here. His eyes locked on Silas. You've been right all along. Julian's jaw tightened. You don't understand. This is the way business is run. Obedience ensures stability. Kale interrupted sharply, voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Obedience built your empire, but silence destroyed it. Silas's eyes flicked between the triplets, their presence unwavering, their authority undeniable, yet different. They weren't demanding obedience, they weren't testing compliance, they were asserting recognition, acknowledgement of what he had endured. And in that, he found strength. Julian's attempts to override the system were interrupted by subtle manual interventions. A cable pulled here, a bypass rerouted there, a console flipped by Kyle with surgical precision. The room was no longer a cage. It was a chessboard, and Julian had assumed he controlled every piece. He hadn't accounted for the wolves, or the Omega who refused to remain silent. Silas exhaled slowly. I told them months ago, the merger will fail, he murmured. But no one wanted to listen. Not Julian, not the board, not anyone. Kale's hand hovered near the console, not to claim, but to guide. Then we will make them listen, he said. Maddox adjusted the restraints with careful fingers, disabling the restrictive systems without removing the cuffs entirely, symbolic acknowledgement that freedom was earned, not granted. Riven moved behind Silas, a protective presence that communicated something far stronger than words. He would not be harmed while they were here. Julian's panic escalated, audible now in the harsh tone of his voice. You can't do this! I can't! Kyle stepped closer, calm but absolute. You already failed. Silas felt it then, the shift from survival to agency. For the first time, he wasn't maneuvering around erasure, he was participating in dismantling it. The room, once a silent tomb of compliance, hummed with the possibility of action. Julian's last defenses faltered as the triplets executed precise, deliberate steps. Firewalls bypassed, override protocols neutralized, encrypted data secured. Silas's voice, quiet but steady, added the final piece. Everything they tried to hide, everything they wanted buried, they will now see. It ends tonight. Kale's wolf pressed close, not for dominance, but for alignment. The Omega at the center of the room, once contained, was now a participant in rewriting reality, and in the stillness that followed, all three triplets understood something crucial. Power without accountability is fragile, and truth once acknowledged, cannot be caged. Silas sat back, eyes steady, as Julian scrambled over the consoles. Panic was foreign to him. It was predictable, a rhythm he could anticipate. The Omega's whispers had always carried weight, and now, finally, someone was listening. "Stop this!" Julian snapped. "Do you know what you're doing? You can destroy us all. Our reputations, the consortium, everything." Kyle stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his presence pressing against Julian's panic like a physical force. "Everything that should have been destroyed already has. What remains is accountability." Riven moved to Silas's side. The wolf within him bristled, sensing the tension, aware of the danger still lingering, but it was no longer directed at Silas. Julian's fear had shifted. The threat was now on him, the manipulator, the one who had weaponized silence and obedience. Maddox's gaze swept the room, sharp and calculating. "You underestimated the Omega," he said coldly. "You thought chains, systems, paperwork could erase him. But chains cannot bind instinct. Systems cannot override truth." Silas's voice was calm but precise. "I didn't want this. I never wanted attention. I just wanted to be seen." Kale's wolf pressed closer, brushing the edge of the chair, an unspoken promise of protection. "You're seen," Kale said, "and that changes everything." Julian's hands shook over the console. "This is treason. You're committing—" "Correction," Maddox interrupted. "This is correction. Something you failed to provide." Silas felt a shift in the air. The control that had once been absolute, the authority that had threatened erasure, was crumbling. Julian's carefully constructed narrative of containment, necessity, and obedience was unraveling. Every file Silas had kept, every copy, every time-stamped note, now mattered. The Omega's quiet diligence had prepared the triplets for this exact moment. Riven crouched slightly, hands open but still, an emblem of patience and power. "You hid behind procedure," he said to Julian. "You weaponized trust. You forgot that the strongest elements are neither contract nor hierarchy. They are recognition, accountability, and instinct." Silas exhaled slowly. He had learned long ago that fear was a tool. He had learned that silence could be armor. But the triplets' presence, their acknowledgement, had shifted the equilibrium. Fear no longer bound him. Power no longer dictated the rules of engagement. Julian's face paled. "You can't expose this. If it goes public—" "It goes public," Kale said simply. "The truth cannot be contained any longer, not while it's alive." Silas looked at the triplets, measuring, silent. Their wolf energy was tempered, steady, aligned, not claiming, not dominating, but reinforcing. They weren't rescuers. They were allies in the acknowledgement of reality. He felt the weight of months, years, of erasure and suppression. And in that moment, as Julian's authority faltered and the room shifted from cage to arena, Silas understood something vital. Survival was no longer about being unseen. Survival, finally, was about being recognized. Kale's hand hovered near Silas's restraint cuffs, not to touch, but to indicate freedom was forthcoming, permission earned by acknowledgement, by validation. Silas met his gaze, the bond silent, deep, unspoken, yet transformative. Maddox leaned in slightly, voice low. "Your work matters. What you've done, what you've preserved, it's worth more than obedience." Silas's breath caught. He had never expected this. The wolves did not demand loyalty. They offered recognition. And recognition, he realized, was the first step toward true agency. Julian backed away, the first cracks in his armor appearing. Authority without integrity had no teeth when confronted with courage and truth. And Silas, the Omega who had been hidden, restrained, and underestimated, was now at the center of a storm that he alone had survived long enough to witness and shape. The room was heavy with the tension of unspoken truths. Silas's wrists still bore the faint pressure of the restraints, but the triplets' presence made them almost symbolic, reminders of what had been endured rather than tools of suppression. He flexed his fingers slowly, aware of every scar and mark, each one a story of survival, obedience forced, and truths ignored. Kale stepped closer, voice quiet but commanding. "The first step is acknowledgement. The rest, choice." Silas swallowed. The words felt heavy but liberating. He had been invisible for so long that being seen was almost disorienting. Yet recognition came with responsibility. If the triplets could see him, the world would eventually have to too. Riven moved to the console, fingers steady over the encrypted system Julian still clung to. "We need access," he said. "Every file, every timestamp, every copy he's kept. Nothing can be left vulnerable to erasure." Maddox approached Silas, their eyes locking. "You did this quietly, silently, and no one noticed. But silence alone can't correct what's been hidden. You need to speak, not to accuse, but to reveal." Silas felt a flicker of fear, tempered with resolve. Speaking meant risk. Speaking meant defiance. Speaking meant finally claiming agency. And yet, the Omega had been trained for survival, for strategy, for subtlety. His whisper now carried more weight than shouts ever could. Julian's panic intensified as Maddox and Riven bypassed safeguards, exposing the hidden manipulations. Silas's voice, low and steady, cut through the oppressive air. All of it. Every altered report, every fabricated incident, every protocol twisted to punish rather than protect. It's documented, and it's coming forward. Kale's wolf pressed near him, not dominance, but alignment, a silent reinforcement. The Omega's courage, tempered by years of invisibility, was now magnified by the triplets' authority. Together, they were unstoppable. Julian's hands shook over the console. "You can't. This isn't legal." "It's truth," Kyle interrupted. "And truth is never illegal." Silas exhaled, a controlled, deliberate breath. Each word he had feared speaking, each fact he had catalogued in silence, now carried authority. The triplets didn't just witness it, they amplified it. Every file transferred, every timestamp verified, every anomaly exposed. Riven leaned close, voice calm. "Silas, you were never the problem. Silence was. And now, that silence ends." The Omega's gaze swept over the triplets, seeing not just alphas, but allies who had arrived without fanfare, without judgment, without expectation. Recognition was enough, but empowerment was coming. Kale's hand hovered near the restraints, the faintest motion suggesting choice. Silas met his eyes, understanding. The chains would come off, not because they were granted, but because he had earned it through endurance, patience, and truth. Julian's protests grew desperate. "If this goes public—" "It will," Maddox said, voice flat, controlled. "The truth cannot be hidden, not from those who survived it, not from those who saw it." Silas felt the first taste of freedom, not just of body, but of agency, voice, and validation. The Omega who had endured suppression, erasure, and underestimation was no longer alone. The triplets had entered expecting compliance, but they left with an ally, a survivor who refused to bow. The room shifted entirely. It was no longer a cage. It was a stage for reclamation, for truth, and for a rebirth of power that respected courage rather than demanded obedience. And in that shift, Silas realized something profound. Survival had been the first step, but recognition, the wolf that refused to bow, was the one that would define the future. Julian's composure had finally cracked. The consoles he had trusted like extensions of his will now betrayed him, flashing with unauthorized transfers, audits, and time-stamped files that Silas had meticulously kept. Every manipulation he had orchestrated, every lie that had gone unchecked, now illuminated in cold, indisputable light. Kale's eyes were sharp, unwavering. "This isn't just about Silas," he said. "It's about the systems you corrupted. Every safeguard you twisted, every protocol weaponized. It ends tonight." Silas's voice was steady. "I didn't come to punish. I came to be recognized. Everything else follows naturally." Maddox stepped to the side, gesturing to the monitors. "You underestimated him, Julian. You underestimated us. And for decades, the consortium suffered because of it. That ends now." Julian's hands trembled over the console. You can't expose this. Contracts, non-disclosures, everything—" Kale interrupted, calm but absolute. "Truth isn't bound by paper. It can't be signed away. It can't be hidden behind hierarchy or fear." Riven leaned in closer to Silas. "You did this quietly, strategically. Now it's time to let it breathe. Let the world see what they tried to erase." Silas exhaled slowly. He had catalogued, recorded, and observed for months. The Omega who had been chained, dismissed, and hidden was now unshackled, not by mercy, but by persistence and the unwavering support of the triplets. Julian's protests grew frantic, but every argument crumbled under the weight of evidence. Every manipulated report, every falsified incident, every suppression now pointed directly at him. His control, once absolute, was evaporating. Cale's wolf pressed near Silas, an invisible barrier against retaliation. "No one will harm you tonight," Cale said quietly. "Not while we're here." Maddox activated the final transfer protocols. Files, recordings, logs, all moved into protected custody. No erasure could touch them. Silas's quiet diligence, combined with the triplets' intervention, ensured that the truth could no longer be buried. Silas looked around the room. The Omega who had been invisible, restrained, and underestimated was now central, empowered, recognized. He was not seeking vengeance, but justice. Measured, precise, unflinching. Julian slumped into the nearest chair, defeated, exposed, and fully accountable. The room that had once felt like a cage now resonated with balance. Power had shifted. Truth had been heard. Silence had been broken. And in the quiet aftermath, Silas understood. Survival had never been enough. Recognition had changed everything. The locked room, once a tomb of compliance and fear, now stood as a testament to endurance, observation, and rebirth. Silas removed the restraints himself, flexing his hands for the first time without hesitation. Every scar, every line, every mark, each told a story of survival that could no longer be erased. Cale, Riven, and Maddox watched silently. The triplets did not claim him. They did not demand allegiance. They offered recognition and protection, leaving the Omega with agency he had never known. Silas finally stood fully, exhaling. He did not return to his former role, not out of spite, but choice. Distance, autonomy, and respect mattered more than any title or position. The wolves had acknowledged him. That acknowledgement carried the weight of freedom. The consortium would change. Julian's authority had been dismantled, not destroyed, but corrected. The internal structures of control, manipulation, and suppression were now exposed, audited, and restrained. The room that had once been a cage would never again hide imbalance or fear. Silas walked to the window, overlooking the Hudson, feeling the air differently. The city below carried on, unaware of the shift that had occurred within the walls of the high-rise. But he knew. He had endured, he had observed, and he had been recognized. Cale's voice came softly from behind him. "Some truths, once seen, cannot be unseen." Silas turned slightly, acknowledging the triplets' presence without needing words. They understood. No praise, no accolades, just quiet acknowledgement. He realized then that rebirth was never about rescue. It was about being recognized, about power aligned with justice, about the wolf that refused to bow, noticing what had been hidden all along. And as he left the locked room behind, Silas understood something deeper. Survival was temporary, but recognition, the acknowledgement of truth, courage, and endurance, was eternal. Who decides which truths are worth being seen and which voices deserve to be heard?